Welcome to Mr. B's Auto Shop. Today we're going to be checking for a loose wheel bearing and replacing a sealed bearing hub on a 2003 GMC Sierra. So the first step is to check for looseness or play in the wheel assembly. And in order to do that, we're going to grab the wheel at the 12 o'clock position and at the 6 o'clock position. If we grab the wheel at 9 and 3, we're checking for steering looseness. If we go at 12 and 6, we are checking for wheel bearing looseness. And you want to move it back and forth, and you can see that the wheel is extremely loose. So we suspect that the problem is the wheel bearing hub. So we're going to go ahead and remove the wheel and check the bearing. All right, we're going to go ahead and pull the wheel off. Once I remove the wheel, I will then be able to inspect the wheel bearing a little bit better. So now we need to verify whether or not the problem is in the bearing, in the ball joints, or in the lower control arms. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it by the wheel studs and shake it up and down. If the only thing that moves is the rotor assembly, put your hand on the ball joint and then go ahead and do it again. Check the lower ball joint, and we can see the play is just in the wheel hub, so we know this is the problem. You don't want to replace parts, like change the wheel hub and then have the problem be in the ball joint. So always verify before we start removing parts. We're now going to go ahead and start disassembling it. The next step to go ahead and remove the hub is to remove the caliper assembly. It's best to go ahead and rotate the steering all the way to the opposite side so we have better access to the bolts. Make sure you're using the correct tool. In this case, it uses a Torx bit. So we're going to go ahead and loosen the bolts, and then we're going to remove the caliper. The caliper assembly is actually two parts. One part is the caliper itself, and then one part is the caliper mounting bracket. Once we get the caliper off, we want to make sure that we don't stretch the caliper hose. So we're going to hang it on a caliper hanger. In order to speed up the process, we're going to go ahead and use a little electric impact. Make sure that you place your bolts somewhere where you're not going to lose them. Also, look at them to make sure they're the same. In a lot of cases, the lower caliper bolt and the upper caliper bolt may be slightly different from each other, and you want to make sure you place them in the correct spot. Once you've identified the differences or that they're the same, then we're going to go ahead and hang the caliper. Once we have the caliper loose, we want to follow the brake line to see if there's any bracketing or that holds the brake line to the wheel assembly or to the spindle assembly. And in this case, we have a bracket right here that holds it. So we're going to go ahead and remove that bolt. All right, so we're going to go ahead and remove this bracket. That way we don't put any stress on the caliper itself. Also, in this vehicle, it has an ABS sensor. A new one will come with the hub assembly. So we're going to go ahead and pull the wiring harness off of the car. So to remove the pins from the control arm, we're going to use panel removing tools, sometimes referred to as panel poppers. So we'll go ahead and place them underneath the clip, and then it will pull the clip out. All right. And then we're going to do the same thing here. And then the clip attaches, or the wiring harness attaches back here in the fender well area. So we're going to go ahead and unclip that as well. Once I've unclipped it from the main harness, I then can use the panel tool to remove the clip. And now I have my harness. The next step, we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper, and then we're going to use a caliper hanger to hang the caliper off of the control arm or the sway bar so that it doesn't hang from the hose. It's really important not to let it hang from the hose. It will damage the hose. So we'll go ahead and pull the caliper off. Put the caliper hanger through the bolt hole and then hang it off of, it doesn't matter what part you hang it off of, as long as it's going to allow or hold the weight. So we're going to hang it like this, and you can see that the caliper line, the brake line is loose. Next, I'm going to go ahead and pull the caliper mounting bracket. It's easiest to use a electric impact or an air impact to remove these bolts. They take an 18mm socket, and then we're going to go ahead and remove the 2 bolts from the back. And we're going to remove the caliper mounting bracket. While you have the caliper mounting bracket off, it's a good idea to check the brake pads. And if we look at these brake pads, we can see they're nearing the end of their service life. This is the pad material, and this is the backing plate. When the pad material and the backing plate are the same dimension, it's a good time to change your pads. As they get closer, they start creating more heat, and then they're more likely to crack. So if you're doing a service like this, you may as well go ahead and change your pads at this point. When we remove the caliper mounting bracket bolts, we can see they had some type of thread locker on them. So we must make sure when we put this back together that we use a thread locker, and that will prevent the bolts from coming loose. Next, we're going to remove the brake rotor. Sometimes the rotor will get stuck to the hub assembly, and if it does, if you strike it with a hammer between the studs, make sure it's between the studs, otherwise you'll damage the studs. It'll help jar it free. But in this case, it's loose, so we're going to go ahead and just remove it. So now we're looking at the hub assembly. So we are going to then remove the bolts from the back side of it. So I'm going to change the camera angle so you can see better what we're doing. All right, we're now looking at the back of the hub assembly. The hub assembly is held on by these 3 large bolts. So our next step would be to remove these 3 bolts. In order to remove the bolts, you're going to need a 15mm socket and a long breaker bar. They are fairly tight. And then we're going to go ahead and loosen them. And then once we get them loose, we can go ahead and spin them out with our hands. Check to see if they had Loctite on them. If they don't have any colored thread locker, then we know that they were just put in there and torqued to specification. So we'll go ahead and remove the rest of them. Now that I have the bolts out, I'm going to go ahead and remove the hub. So we're going to reposition the camera so you can get a better view. So use a rubber mallet, and you're going to go ahead and give it a few strikes to help loosen it. Once you get it kind of loose, you'll be able to get that last bolt all the way out. Be careful, they can be kind of heavy, and you don't want to drop them on your toes. Pull it out with the line, and then on the back of it you will have the dust shield, so go ahead and remove that, and then we're ready to install the new part. I now have my new part. First thing you want to do is thread it through the backing plate and make sure that the sensor lines up correctly with the plate. Once you've done that, you can see the little witness mark here that shows where the opening was. So I'm going to match the opening to where it came from, and I'm going to slide the new hub in. Make sure you have the line out of the way before you tighten it, and we're going to hold it in place, and we are going to start the top bolt, and then we'll go ahead and start the other ones. Once you get a couple of them started, you can remove your hands, as the bolts will support it, and then you're going to run all three in just till they bottom out. The next step would be to use a torque wrench and tighten them to the correct torque specification. The factory spec for these bolts is 96 foot-pounds. We are going to use a click style torque wrench to tighten it to the specification. When using a torque wrench, make sure that you grab it from the lowest portion of the grip to prevent you getting a false reading, and you'll hear it click. And I'm going to go ahead and do the next one. They make digital torque wrenches and other style, but these ones are pretty reliable for your heavier duty work. And then we're going to do the last one. And then I'm always a big fan of double checking. So go ahead and double check your tightness. And now the wheel is, or the hub assembly is torqued. Once we have the bolts torqued to the specification, we're then going to start reassembling the brake assembly. So we're first going to slide the rotor on. And then we're going to apply the caliper mounting bracket. Before we do that, we're going to need to apply Loctite to the bolts. The bolts have a lot of the old residual Loctite on them, so we're going to go ahead and clean those off with the wire wheel. We've now cleaned the bolts off, and we are going to use a blue thread locker. Thread locker comes in different colors indicating the strength of the locker. And we are going to put one bead down the edge of the bolt, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the other one. You don't have to put it all the way around. As you can see, the thread locker will run down the threads on its own, and as you rotate them to tighten them, they will spread the thread locker throughout the bolt surface. Then we're going to take our caliper mounting bracket with the brake pads on it and slide it over the rotor, and then we're going to start the bolts. Make sure you start both bolts before you tighten either one of them, so that you can make sure that it is going to be a flush mount and not be crooked or cause any problems. Run them in by hand. and we're going to torque them. If you have a problem with the rotor tilting on you while you do this, just take one of the lug nuts and spin it on. I like spinning them on backwards. That way it doesn't damage the conical shape at the end and cause a problem with the wheels. Now we will torque the caliper mounting bracket bolts. The torque spec for the caliper mounting bracket is 129 foot-pounds. It uses an 18mm socket, and we'll go ahead and torque the bolts to that spec. Remember, once it clicks, go ahead and stop. And then we're going to do the bottom one. And I always like to double check them. And now the caliper mounting bracket is torqued into place. So next I'm going to hang the caliper, remove it from the control arm. Make sure that the brake line is not twisted. Sometimes when you do it, you'll twist it and that'll cause a kink, and that'll make the brakes drag when you release the brakes. So make sure you do not kink the line. And we're going to go ahead and slide the caliper onto the mounting. Then we will install the caliper bolts. Make sure if they are different that you put the correct bolt into the correct location. And then we're going to run them in till they bottom out, and then we will torque them to the correct specification. The torque for the caliper mounting bolts is 80 foot-pounds. So we are going to go ahead and tighten them down. It's easier to run them in till they make contact and then torque them. That way you're not spending as much time. And then once they seat, we can go ahead and use the torque wrench. Don't crank on them with the electric impact, because you may tighten them beyond the torque spec. And then, well, at that point, there's no use torquing them. And then we're going to do the bottom one. Now that we have the caliper torqued to spec, we will go ahead and reattach the hose bracket. It has a little locating pin on it, so make sure that you put the locating pin in the correct spot. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten the bolt down. Next, we're going to route the ABS connector. So first, we're going to snap it into the caliper hose bracket. Then we're going to place it into the two locations where the old one was. Sometimes when you remove the old one, the old piece will break out. So just use a pick and dig it out of the hole. So we're going to go ahead and route this. Plug the connector in at the top and go ahead and place it through the guide hole. Once you have that done, double check your work. Once you've double checked all your work, the next step would be to install the tire. Make sure you remove the lug nut that you put on to hold the rotor in place. And then once you install the tire and we lower it to the ground, we will want to torque it to make sure that the wheel does not come off. So you can run them in with the gun till they make contact. so that way when you set it down, it doesn't damage the studs. And it will give us the ability to check for play to make sure the new hub is in good condition. Don't tighten one side all the way first. Run them in, skipping a lug nut all the way around so that you do not cause the rim to bend or cause damage to the hub or the rotor. Once you get them in, just gently run them till they touch. You don't want to actually tighten them, because if you do, you may over torque them and then you'll have to loosen them later. And check for play. And spin it to see if you hear any noise. If you have no play or no noise when you're rotating the wheel, you have now completed changing a hub bearing assembly on a 2003 GMC Sierra. Hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.